Hello, I'm Russell Haythorn with Denver 7, and welcome to Denver Decides. This community partnership is dedicated to accessible and transparent elections. The partnership includes the League of Women Voters of Denver, Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation, and is presented by Denver 8 TV. Our mission today is to present a ballot issue forum in anticipation of the general election coming up on Tuesday, November 3rd. Among the numerous amendments and ordinance questions on this year's ballot is Proposition 116. This measure asks voters if the state's income tax rate should be cut from 4.63% to 4.55%. Our format for this forum will follow a basic debate outline with opening and closing statements, cross-examination, and will include responses to questions submitted by the forum organizers. Let's begin by meeting the participants who will present and discuss the pros and cons of Proposition 116. Beginning to my right is Mr. John Caldera, president of the Independence Institute, and he will be speaking in favor of Prop 116. And to my left is Scott Wasserman, president of the Bell Policy Center, and he will be speaking against Proposition 114. Welcome to both of you gentlemen tonight. We will begin with 1-minute opening statements from both of our speakers. John Caldera, you're up first, speaking in favor of Proposition 116. You have 1 minute.
Thank you. And by the way, thank you for putting this together. I think it's a really important exercise. Let me just start off with, this is a very simple, basic, and very mild tax cut that helps everyone who pays income tax the same amount. It brings the tax rate down proportionally for everyone. But what's really impressive about this is the coalition behind it, that the people working for it include me and Governor Jared Polis. If you know me and Jared Polis, we don't agree on many things, if ever, but yet I'm working with him to pass this initiative. As he said, particularly in this challenging time, I think Coloradans certainly need tax relief. The governor went on to say an income tax cut is a broad-based relief and not only helps families get by in a challenging time, but also helps our economy grow. And I'm happy to work with Jared Polis to get this done.
John, we appreciate your opening statement. Scott Wasserman, it is your turn now to deliver your opening statement against Proposition 116.
Well, excellent. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this important issue. Proposition 116 is nothing more than a gimmick. If Proposition 116 passes, the average Coloradan will get about $40 back in their tax cut, and what they'll get are additional cuts to schools, roads, healthcare, the kinds of things that all Coloradans have prioritized and say they want from their state government. In contrast, millionaires will actually get around $800 back, something that I think all of us can agree they don't need, and they'll be just fine if they can deal with that, and they'll just be fine with the tax cuts. At the end of the day, we really have to ask ourselves who is winning with this measure and why it's necessary. The Colorado State Legislature cut 25% of the state budget last year. We have a huge backlog in funding for our schools, roads, and other infrastructure that we care about in this state. This is insult to injury, will make things worse, and more importantly, will make our tax code more unfair and make our state funding even more inadequate.
Scott, thank you for that opening statement. John, you as well. And now it's time for rebuttal. And Scott, you will have 1 minute to offer a rebuttal to John's opening statement.
Sure. What John calls a mild tax cut is anything but. We'll be talking about this more, I'm sure. But next year, I mentioned last year, the state legislature cutting 25% of the state budget. Next year, the state legislature, because of the COVID-induced recession, will be cutting $1.3 billion from the state budget. This simply adds $160 million to the tab. It's interesting to me that John talks so much about Jared Polis's support for this measure, and I don't believe it's an official endorsement that's come from the governor. But what we do know about the governor is that he's talked about a revenue-neutral tax cut that ultimately makes the tax code more progressive. This doesn't make the tax code more progressive. In fact, it tilts it even further in favor of the wealthy, who I think we can all agree don't need a tax cut right now.
Scott, thank you for that. John, your turn to offer a rebuttal.
Governor Jared Polis gave a full-throated support of 116. It was part of his campaign pledge when running for governor that he would cut corporate loopholes and use that money for a broad-based rate cut. He did just that. This tax cut is mild. It's 0.4% of what the state spends. Now, your families have had to make certain cuts. I think the state can do so as well. But what's odd is this has already been paid for, even just by Jared Polis's bills alone. He signed 2 different bills this year closing certain loopholes, bringing in over $170 million. This tax cut saves us about $160 million. It's been paid for by that alone. And I can understand why Jared Polis is concerned about the economic future of Colorado. We're in a competitive world. We are neighbored by states that have no income tax whatsoever. And businesses and productive people are leaving high tax states and going to no tax states like Wyoming, Nevada, Texas, and Florida.
John, thank you for that rebuttal. And now, gentlemen, on to the cross-examination round. And this is round 1 of questions. You'll have 4 opportunities to ask questions of each other and offer responses. And John, back to you to start. This is your turn to ask Scott a question.
Scott, you talk a lot about helping out poor people when it comes to our tax code. But yet, out of all the taxes that people pay, the only effectively progressive tax is our flat tax by the Department of Revenue's own numbers. So I'm curious why it is that those taxes on the ballot that raise taxes on the poor through tobacco taxes, which has an effective rate of 51% higher for the lower income people versus people making $200,000, property tax increase under Gallagher, a payroll tax increase, all of which the Colorado government says disproportionately hurts poor people. Yet you support those taxes on those poor people, while this tax proportionally helps every taxpayer and does bring tax relief. Why is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I mean, you're right. A flat income tax is mildly progressive, and so it's strange to me that you would suggest cutting it. If we cut the income tax, then the one mildly progressive component of our state's tax code would actually be cut, and we would be taking away the one thing that makes the tax code more progressive and ask that wealthier people pay more. So, I don't think most Coloradans understand that if you look at the overall effective tax burden in the state of Colorado, wealthy people pay far less of their income than low and middle income people. This isn't just about helping poor people, by the way. I think that every Coloradan, regardless of the amount of income they make, relies upon our roads, relies upon our schools. We know that public investment actually lowers the costs that people grapple with every day and actually subsidizes the very high cost of living in Colorado. You often refer to this money being stolen from people and it goes into a vacuum. Far from it. It actually helps Coloradans afford life here.
Scott, thank you for that. Time is up on that. But we'll continue with cross-examination round 2. Now, Scott, your turn to ask John a question first.
Great.
Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So as you know, the legislature is going to cut $1.3 billion from the budget next year. If we pass this, that's going to add $160 million more dollars to the amount they have to cut. And we know that that amount is equal to the senior homestead property tax exemption. We know that it's almost the cost of full-day kindergarten, a huge priority for Governor Polis, whom you support. And so I guess my question for you is, if the legislature cuts those things, what will you tell school parents and what will you tell seniors about why we had to cut those things and in order to pay for your tax cut?
John, you have 1 minute.
Be careful, it's not my tax cut, it's also the governor's tax cut, and it's also your tax cut and your tax cut. I find it interesting. We both run policy shops, think tanks, and the first place you go to find savings in government is in education. It seems to me that giving tax breaks to rich people to buy Teslas is something that should not be happening. I find it interesting that we give Quentin Tarantino millions of dollars to make films that don't even exist in Colorado. But you go right to those core functions. Colorado is the only state that has a vestige of something before Social Security. It's the old age pension fund, the only state in America that still has that. So you wonder, if we're going to be looking at those issues, Why would we worry about that? Let's also have a conversation of the flood of money that's come into the state under the new Trump tax code, where we as Coloradans are actually paying more in state income tax. This bill, originally done by Senator Sonnenberg, was meant to address that.
John, I sensed a question in there, so that's good news because we're continuing with cross-examination. And now it's your turn to ask Scott a question in round 2.
Okay. I really do want to get back to why you support tax increases on poor people on this ballot, on 3 other initiatives that don't cut taxes for anyone. I really want to understand the genuineness that you're going to say this is somehow unfair for poor people when you want to effectively tax them so much more with Prop EE, with the Gallagher repeal, with the payroll tax. Now, I understand there will be benefits from that, but will you agree that those taxes hurt the people you claim to be worried about, those people on the lower end of the scale here in Colorado?
Scott, 1 minute.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that you want to change the topic and you don't want to talk about the blunt instrument that cutting the state income taxes and the impact that that will have on services. You're absolutely right that I do think it's time for this state to repeal Gallagher. I think it's time for us to take these ratios and arbitrary limits out of the Constitution so that communities can make decisions for themselves. Happy to talk more about the Gallagher repeal issue. There's absolutely nothing in that measure that's going to increase taxes for property, residential property holders. But what we have seen is that local communities, precisely because they can't change their property tax structures, have increasingly relied on sales tax, which is probably the most regressive way to tax Coloradans. The entire system, the entire status quo that is upheld by Gallagher and Tabor, sealed into our Constitution, upholds a status quo that is incredibly unfair to Coloradans, has underfunded vital services that everyone cares about, lowers their cost of life, and ultimately just benefits the wealthy people who can come to this state and live here insulated from those
Scott,
cuts.
time's up. Thank you for that. Continuing with cross-examination, and now Scott, it's your turn to ask John a question. And again, John will have 1 minute to respond.
Great. So it's interesting because, as I think you know, there's a lot of better ways to provide economic relief to the 97% of Coloradans who make less than $250,000 in this state. So I'm just kind of curious, why didn't you put a more targeted tax cut on the ballot that only applied to those 97% of Coloradans who make less than $250,000? And why did you choose a tax cut that actually gives 55% of the benefit to the top 3% of Colorado earners?
That's simply not true. It gives the exact same benefit to every person who pays income tax in Colorado. So
$90 million doesn't go back to the taxpayers.
Those people who pay more in income tax certainly will get more back under this tax cut, but people in lower income brackets and middle income people also get this. You know, I find it odd that you belittle a $40 tax cut for people during this time. Are you telling me that these people don't deserve some bit of tax relief from a state that has brought in more and more money through fees no one voted on, a windfall from the Trump tax code, which, by the way, has a very odd effect in that here in Colorado we pay more under the Trump tax code to state government, some $400 million more, and the governor signed in $170 worth of new revenue enhancements without a vote of the people this year. This tax decrease for everyone has been paid for many times over.
Keeping with our format of cross-examination, now, John, I believe it's your turn to ask Scott a question. John, you can ask another question, and Scott, again, you'll have 1 minute to respond.
Scott brings up some very good points about how working people get hurt by taxes in Colorado. And that this relief helps all Coloradans, which is why the governor is working with us to pass this. One of those taxes is our state sales tax, which is at 2.9%. I'm wondering, since you want to help people at the lower end, would you join me in co-sponsoring a sales tax cut next year that's only a sales tax cut with nothing else on it to bring it down to, 2.5% to give relief to people who need it on the lower end of the scale?
Scott?
I'm a huge supporter of sales tax reform. We absolutely need to reform our
Is that a
tax
yes?
code. We absolutely need to reform our tax code so that it is two things: adequate, so that your teachers aren't the 51st worst paid in the country, and that it is fair. So absolutely, we should reform our we should.
Is that a yes?
We should put a sales tax on services. We should cut sales tax. But the question for you, John, is how
is
are
it a
you
yes
going,
or a no?
But
It's a pretty
John,
straightforward
how are you going to offset
John,
that
let
cut
him
and make
finish.
sure that we are adequately funding the things that people care about and need in the state?
I'll take that as a question.
Scott, thank you for that response. John, thank you. And now, Scott, we'll continue with this. We'll continue with cross-examination. You can ask John a question.
Yeah. So it seems like over at the Independence Institute, there's a newfound love affair with creating a progressive tax code, which I think is great. I guess my question for you is Tabor actually explicitly prohibits a graduated tax code, so different tax rates for different levels of income, like 37 other states have, and they use that in order to offset the inequities in their tax code. Will you support me, or actually why won't you support an amendment to Tabor that actually allows us to tax different incomes at different rates and makes for a fairer tax code?
John?
First of all, your answer to the question I asked was obviously a no. So you don't want to lower taxes.
No, I absolutely support sales
Will
tax
you
reform.
join
And we should
me?
absolutely cut sales tax.
I asked a simple
The question
question.
is, how will you offset that cut to
Scott,
sales
this
tax
is
and make
John's
sure we
time.
can fund our roads? He cut me off in the earlier question. I have a right to respond.
The question was, would you join me as a co-sponsor to a citizens initiative to lower the sales tax to 2.5%? I did not get a yes or a no. I would love to have a yes or no. All other things being equal, would you join me in that tax cut?
But
The
all
answer-
other things
the-
are not
the
equal
answer
if you
is
cut
obviously
revenue
no.
and then you underfund and cut schools and
Then
pay
do us
teachers less.
Then do us the dignity of just saying, no, I would not join you in that.
But I support cutting the sales tax. But would you support?
No, I would not.
You
And I
would not
think-
support amending Tabor to make it so that
Gentlemen,
we can
my
tax
reminder,
different,
the
different
timer's
incomes
running,
at different
but this
rates.
is a healthy debate. I'll let it go.
Let me run this by. You and I have a fundamental disagreement on tax policy. I believe taxes should be low, flat, and transparent. You believe they should not be flat or transparent. This is why you support so many fees, like the hospital provider fee and the
So now we're going to
faster
talk
fee.
about Gallagher. We're going to talk about an
Well,
entirely
we're
other
talking
ballot
about the
measure.
state budget, are we not?
Scott, you have 20 seconds.
I have 20 seconds to what?
You have
To-
20
to
seconds
respond.
to answer that question.
So I absolutely believe in a transparent tax system. That's why we post information about all of this. Anybody in Colorado can and should go to the state legislature's website where they can see all this information. What John doesn't want you to know is that Tabor explicitly prohibits a fair tax code that puts less tax burden on low and middle income voters and actually raise taxes on the wealthy so that they can pay their fair share.
Both of you, thank you very much for that healthy and respectful debate. We're moving on now to the card questions, and this is round one of card questions. These questions come from the event organizers or the forum organizers, and again, you'll have 1 minute to respond to these questions. Each of you will have 1 minute to respond to these questions. And so I believe John Caldera, who is here speaking in support of Proposition 116, will go first. So, John, here's the first card question. It's been reported that if Proposition 116 passes, nearly $236 million will be cut from the state's general fund, and that these cuts will likely come in the form of permanent cuts to K through 12 schools, higher education, healthcare, and transportation. Is this true?
Absolutely, it is not true. You're looking over a several-year period for that amount of money, and it's always interesting that we go right to education because that's one of our budget issues that we value the most. We don't seem to be talking about all the extra money we have put into the state budget that has already paid for this. Remember why Governor Polis supports this amendment, this proposition. It's because he was able to close loopholes and bring in even more money to the state than this takes out. It's already paid for. We've already paid $1 billion a year, almost, in a hospital provider tax. That tax we never got to vote on. Talk about transparency. The hospital provider fee, by law, doesn't even allow that fee tax to appear on your hospital bill. So transparency, we do not have. Voter consent, we do not have. What we have is a system that we've paid for this tax relief. I agree with the governor. It is time for this tax relief that also helps our economy.
John, thank you very much. Scott, your turn to answer the same question. on the issue of nearly $236 million being cut from the state's general fund. Is that true?
So absolutely, it's true. So, and as I said, the budget situation that our state faces is dire. Last year, we cut 25% of the state budget. This year, we're going to cut another $1.3 billion. We don't talk about education, higher education, and healthcare because we want to. We talk about those things, and I encourage you to talk to the people who actually sit around the budget-making table and make these choices. Those are the priorities that consistently have come under the chopping block because legislators at this point have little to no choice. And so either senior homestead exemption or full day kindergarten or gets cut, or we raise the negative factor. Either way, what's not happening in this state is our roads are not being paid for because we don't have a sustainable revenue stream for our roads. Our schools are not being funded at the levels that I think parents expect them to be. And so absolutely, these are priorities that will be cut. The money has to come from somewhere. And our only point is that the people who benefit with this tax cut, they'll be just fine. The people who get $40 is $40. But the people who get $40 back can't build roads with those $40.
Scott, thank you very much. Time's up on that. Continuing with the theme, though, the COVID-19 crisis, and Scott, it'll be your turn to answer first. Great. The COVID-19 crisis brought on many economic challenges for Colorado. Is now the right time for more budget cuts?
Well, now's absolutely the wrong time for budget cuts. I think what we found is that we have a tremendous amount of unemployment. We have a tremendous amount of inequality. I think when you look at recovery in the state, what you're seeing is that low-wage sectors are not recovering nearly as quickly as middle income and higher wage sectors. And so the result is that we have a huge number of Coloradans who will be extremely hurt if at the end of the day full day kindergarten is taken away, or if higher education tuition goes up as people need to retrain to go back into the workforce. So this is precisely the wrong time to pull the rug out from Coloradans who rely on public services to afford life in Colorado.
Thank you, Scott. John,
same question.
Your turn. Yeah.
I don't think Governor Polis wants to hurt the people of Colorado. I don't think Governor Polis wants to take away classrooms or teachers or roads. I don't think Governor Polis wants to do something to hurt the state budget. But Governor Polis knows that there's a reality. The reality is we're suffering from COVID. People need some relief. Scott, you might belittle $40 to a family, but I know a lot of families for whom $40 is a night out. It's a backpack for their kids or a new pair of shoes. They need help as well. It's interesting that if we want recovery, we need to make sure that we have an economic system here in Colorado that attracts the most productive people who build the businesses here. I live in Boulder. We have a new neighbor in Boulder who is a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. He retreated from California from their high progressive taxes to a lower tax state. He's now paying taxes in Colorado. A tax rate cut does not mean that we're going to have less tax revenue. The Art Laffer curve shows just the opposite. I want to know if you think Governor Polis really does want to hurt people in Colorado.
John, time's up, but we're continuing with card questions. And John, you'll go first on this one. Will the benefits of this proposition be mostly for the wealthy taxpayers or corporations? If so, why? If not, why not?
Well, we've danced around this over and over again.
Right.
Everyone will get exactly the same tax cut. If you pay a lot more in income tax, that means your cut will be proportionally the same as someone who pays very little in income tax. You know, if we keep going to play this class baiting, we still need to ask a question. This is a tax cut for everyone who pays taxes. It still keeps together a progressive income tax that you admit is progressive. That does not change. It proportionally is the same. But you are pushing for taxes on poor people that hit them harder on tobacco products. There will be local tax increases on property. Our state says that people pay on the lower end of the scale, effectively pay 4 times more in property taxes. There will be a payroll tax if the family leave measure comes, and that hurts other people as well. So I know we like to play this game that this is a tax cut for the rich. It's a tax cut for everyone. It is the other tax proposals you support that are targeted to the poor.
John, thank you. Scott, your turn.
Well, I mean, I think this is a really good opportunity to talk about why I think this measure is actually on the ballot. This measure is on the ballot as a preemptive response to a different vision for our tax code. I and a number of other people have worked on a progressive tax code that would actually cut taxes for 97% of Coloradans, create three new tax brackets, and actually raise the kind of revenue we need for better roads, better schools, better health care, lower higher education tuition. So we know that we can create a fairer tax code and actually give tax relief to the people who need it. And so that's why I asked the question earlier. We have a lot of options at our disposal. So it's just odd to me that the proponents are sort of aware of the fact that the wealthy will get a benefit from this tax cut, and actually $90 million out of $160 million of this cut will go to the wealthiest 3%. So knowing that, they're still doing it, even though I think we can all agree that the wealthiest, particularly right now, given income inequality, don't need it. We have a choice. We can create a fair tax code.
Gentlemen, thank you both. You asked such robust and healthy questions of one another that I don't have time for my last card question, but that's okay. Moving on to closing statements. Each of you will have 1 minute to deliver your closing statement, and we'll reverse the order that we started with. So, John, I believe you delivered your opening statement first. That means, Scott, you will deliver your closing statement first. Scott, you have 1 minute.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. You know, I think at the end of the day, Coloradans should do the math for themselves. If $40 for you makes sense, if for every dollar that you get back in this tax cut, losing $4.50 of public services makes good mathematical sense for you and your family, and you think you can deal with additional cuts to our schools and healthcare and transportation, then absolutely you should vote for this measure. If, on the other hand, it offends you that we would put a tax cut like on this, that we would cut $160 million worth of public services from our state budget, while at the same time handing $800 checks back to millionaires that we all agree don't deserve that or need that right now in this economy, then you should vote no. At the end of the day, this is a gimmick. And this is part of the reason why the state of Colorado has such a great economy on the one hand, and on the other hand is unable to provide the most basic vital services that we all count on, poor, middle income, or rich, to thrive here.
Scott, thank you very much for your closing argument. John, now your turn to deliver a closing statement. You have 1 minute.
Go back to what I started with. Our governor, when campaigning, said he wanted to close loopholes in our tax code to bring more money into the state. And with that, he wanted to lower Colorado's flat tax rate. This is exactly what this does, which is why he supports it so strongly. I don't believe our governor wants to hurt education or roads or our kids. I think he wants to help them by having a strong economy. I think he wants to make Colorado attractive to people in other states to come here and do their business. That's why this tax cut is not just good for you, whether you're getting $400 back or $500 back or $800 back. It's good for Colorado. Scott talks about wanting a tax cut for 97%. It's okay to have a tax cut for 100% of Coloradans. We all make Colorado, and we want to make Colorado better. Join me, join the governor. Vote yes on 116 and give yourself a little tax break.
Gentlemen, thank you both. Great questions, great answers. We appreciate both of you being here, John Caldera and Scott Wasserman. And we hope we have given you a fair look at the pros and cons for Proposition 116. Again, it is asking voters if the state's income tax rate should be cut from 4.63% to 4.55%. Our thanks also to Denver Decides and its partners, which include Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation and the League of Women Voters of Denver. Denver Decides is presented by Denver 8 TV. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd. Let your voice be heard. Be sure you are registered to vote, and be sure to get out there and vote. For complete election information online, go to denverdecides.org. I'm Russell Haythorn with Denver 7. Thank you for joining us.